Hello and welcome to Season 9, Episode 1 of Unlimited Opinions. I'm Adam Bishop.
I'm Mark Bishop.
And this is our first episode of a very new season where we're reading a new book, Orestes Brownson, The American Republic, Its Constitution, Tendencies, and Destiny, which I think should be a really interesting read. He's really just trying to go through, and I think really his point of this book is answering the question of what is America? This is, of course, at the end of, the Civil War is when this is being published. So there's a question in a lot of people's minds is how does America function? What is the country that is America, going forward past the Civil War? And for this time, we read the editor's introduction, which just gave a little bit of a background of Orestes Brownson's life, which I think we talk about a little bit. But more interesting is his preface and his introduction. And the introduction is really the first chapter of this book, where he lays out really what he's going to do and what possessed him to write this. But what did you think of these first few pieces of this book?
First, I should confess that I think I might have heard of this guy's name, but I didn't know anything about him, what he's published, what his views were, or anything like that. So I profess my ignorance. But I think I might have heard of him, but certainly don't have any knowledge of him.
Yeah, I know very little, and that's only because he was referenced in evidently Russell Kirk was a big fan of him, and he's referenced at the end of Russell Kirk's The Roots of American Order. So I know a little bit. I knew basic information about his life, but I didn't really too much about his ideals and stuff like that.
But I will say, and to answer your question, is I'm hooked. I mean, I think really, I thought the introduction was great by the editor. It's a republication.
Editor's Thomas E. Woods Jr., I guess we should say his name.
Published in 2003 originally, like you said, it was in the 1860s, I guess. But and that was very informative, kind of giving a snapshot of who this guy was, the era that he wrote this, and but really, I thought the preface was fascinating, and just as a contrast to the introduction or preface of the last chapter.
Yes, I was going to talk about that too,
because it's funny. They both are saying having the same disclaimer, kind of. I'm attempting to render the truth of the subject as best I can, but Mr. Brownson says, this is not a academic paper; it's a essay, and I thought it was really interesting. He says he's withdrawn or refutes any prior statements or opinions or publications that are inconsistent with this book. So he's like restating his current view, which has develed over time. Which is,
I guess, to say a little bit about his life, we'll talk about a little bit more. But he was really sort of a journalist, I guess, of sorts. He was an editorial writer, more or less, on a few different journals, it sounds like, throughout his life. And at this point in time, he went through, one of the things I think is most interesting about him is he's a convert to Catholicism. He went through a bunch of different faiths that were popping up and becoming, a little bit more popular throughout the 1800s. He lived 1803 to 1876. And so he got really into like the Unitarians and stuff like that.
He was a minister.
He was a minister. And so a lot of his editorials started out as, within that sort of worldview. And then gradually he came to Catholicism. And that's where he ultimately ended up for the rest of his life.
Yes.
And his editorials became expressly, this is a Catholic publication now. And it was a Catholic take on politics and everything that was going on. But to touch on the preface, I thought the biggest difference I saw between this and the last book we read is that he's incredibly humble.
Yes.
He says, I know this is not going to be perfect. Yes. This isn't really my style. I prefer the shorter essays. Yes. Take this with a grain of salt, but if at least one person, takes something of value of this in the future, then I'll be happy. And that's all I need to do. Compared to, George Lakoff last chapter is like, I think this is right. Everywhere I've looked, this is correct and holds to be true, my weirdo interpretation of things. But he reminds me, Orestes Brownson does, of a lot of Tolkien. That same attitude. If you read his letters or him talking about his works, it's like it could be 10 times better, very much in the idea of, this is, trifling work, essentially. You get that idea a lot. Maybe it's Catholics who are like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's... people who are religious sometimes tend to be, I know it's not commonly held belief in pop culture, but people that are truly religious, I think are more humble, and are less judgmental. and really, really smart people know how little they know.
Yes.
It's like somebody who's just kind of like marginally intelligent, lake off, thinks they're more brilliant than they are.
Yes.
They don't understand how little they know and how more complex a concept, like the political concepts are and political philosophy is, because they don't really truly appreciate, the subject matter, how complex it is. And like in my own experience as a young man, I was much more arrogant than I am now. I'm not saying I'm not arrogant, but the more I know about things, the more I realize the less I know. You think, well, that's contradictory, but it really isn't, because you just expand your field of knowledge. Just kind of like any subject. If you just know a little bit about it, you think you have a firmer grasp in some circumstances than you do if you really get into it. But I really like how he turned to phrase and think it's going to be an interesting read. And I really love the book itself.
Yes.
It's just a fairly simple hardcover book, but I absolutely love, what do you call this little thing that's a little bookmark? What do you call that? What do you call
a little
this thing?
silk ribbon bookmark that's attached to the book itself.
Ribbon.
Yeah,
That's
ribbon.
what I'm saying,
Ribbon. Yeah.
That's something that should be in every book. Although I love bookmarks too.
Yes.
I have my own little leather bookmarks, little wooden bookmark.
Well, let's talk about the editor's introduction.
I won't lose it. But I mean, there's something to be said about the physical book.
Yes.
And this is from, how do you say it? Regnery Publishing, which is a conservative Catholic publication, I think, Our publishing house.
In the Conservative Leadership series is what this was
I wonder what else is in this series. I'll have to check that out. Yeah. Of course, I have that 3-volume set of conservative...
4 volumes, I think, isn't it?
Oh, my God. Yeah, it probably is.
History of conservatism.
I started it once, but Yes. All right, yes, let's get to it.
Yeah, I don't know how much you want to talk about, but I think just giving some background on his life. I do like the first sentence of the editor's introduction. He said, if scholars of Orestes Brownson have agreed on one thing, it is that neither the man nor his book, The American Republic, has received the attention it deserves. I think that's true. Yes. I mean, very few people know this guy's name, as far as I can tell. Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, Orestes Brownson was born in 1803, born in Vermont, excuse me. And so it says, the editor says, his religious interests began during his childhood. He tells us that at age 9, he defended free will against someone defending the predestinarian views of Jonathan Edwards. So if that story is true, he'd been a very smart kid and very, very interested in, religion and things like that. But then he became a Universalist preacher, and then in 1833, a Unitarian pastor. And then he founded the Boston Quarterly in 1838, and that, featured a lot of the top people in the Transcendentalist movement. So with all these religious circles, a lot of the everything is sort of the same, fundamentally worldview. But he looked forward to a religion of the future that would replace the dogmatism of traditional religion with something more cosmopolitan and this worldly. Something, I think that's also a very modern concept right now as well. But by 1844, he'd converted to Catholicism, and he was called America's Newman by some people, I guess as a reference to John Henry Newman. And then he published Brownson's Quarterly Review, which he continued to publish from 1865 to 1875. In 1844 he started that until 1875, with a brief hiatus from 1865 till 1872. So very interested in religion, it seems like is what a lot of his life centered around through his religious conversions and things like that. I don't know if you have anything to add on those notes there.
Good summary.
Thank you.
I'm interested to know if you can get a hold of Brownson's Quarterly Review publication. Probably can somewhere, some library.
Yeah. There's probably an anthology of his essays and stuff like that somewhere.
I wonder if they're at the University of Florida.
Well, he was buried, I think he talks about this later, at Notre Dame in Indiana.
Was that in the introduction?
Yeah, somewhere. I read it somewhere. I think it's in the introduction, probably at the end, about his death.
God, I missed that.
But all of his works are there,
mother
too.
Kept talking to me when I was trying to read.
But then he goes on to talk about, so what is the period that we're looking at here when he's writing this, of course, after the Civil War. Yeah. But he says, Brownson found himself increasingly concerned with the state of the Union, a preoccupation he shared with many of his fellow Americans, of course, in the rise to the outbreak of the Civil War. And so he was interesting opinions on abolition.
Yes.
Because he was opposed to slavery, but he was also opposed to the abolitionists.
Yes.
He was like, we can't really force these people to enact the laws of states that are not their own laws. Because he's
I want to elaborate on that a little bit. And I assume he's going to get into some of those concepts, although it had been resolved by war by the time he wrote this. But I'm reading Shelby Foote's multi-volume history of the Civil War, and I'm struck by a couple of things with it. But one of them was, and I've read other things about the Civil War, but like the abolitionists were so strident. And I'm not saying this, kind of sharing the blame, but there was some unreasonableness with the position they were taking, and I think, well, I guess what I should say is there was just not an appreciation on either side the hazards of the Civil War, and like you hear sometimes, to bring it to modern times, people talk about like a national divorce, or we're going to have a civil war, or we're going to fight over this or whatever, and people are so casual about it. I can only imagine how many people would die if the United States was literally at war with itself, especially since it's not generally a geographical issue that we're marbled in among each other. It's more like Pakistan splitting off of India. Where it really would be a huge separation and migration from one region to another. We're talking about millions upon millions of people that would be murdered.
Because if you look at
we fought this out, if we can't figure out what we're doing together.
If you look at the Civil War, at least there was at least a little bit of a clearer division of these are the states who are pro-slavery, these are the states who are anti-slavery. There was a clear divide along the North and the South, and of course there were ideological differences within those states themselves.
Well, especially
but now
like Tennessee. Tennessee had huge regions that were pro-North, but they seceded. And there were people that were getting hung because they were trying to secede from the secessionists. And Lincoln was very intent on getting military there, but his leadership was not very effective in early years.
If you look at the makeup of America now, it's not so much there is that hard line, like you say. It's like, you could say the coastal states are generally more liberal, but it's like if something like that were to happen, it'd more so be us fighting people down the street, rather than one state going to war with the other. All out just brawls everywhere if something like that were to happen, which we hope it does not. But his argument about the abolitionists is he treated with contempt the higher law doctrine advocated by some abolitionists who said no constitution could make legitimate so morally outrageous an institution as slavery. But he was opposed to that because he's arguing that essentially they're saying that they're against law in all forms. If you say that the law really doesn't have any meaning, then what is law? And I can kind of see his argument there. I'm sure he'll get into it a little bit more in the book. Outside of
there's a certain logic to it that if you state at the outset there are some laws that we can agree on or have been agreed upon in the past. Essentially, there's some things that are exempt from lawmaking, and he's kind of saying that, well, if you agree with that, you don't really agree with an ability of a people to establish the laws. I don't buy that. I think they're, and maybe you're getting into this in a minute. Maybe I'm jumping ahead, but I'm fascinated by this concept of a providential nation of laws that that's almost a higher calling, that each nation has its own city of God image, like a chosen people, so to speak. Like Israel has theirs, ancient Greece had theirs for art and whatever, and the United States has ours, and maybe and it's an interesting argument that you're as a people, if you are consistent with God's whatever God's vision is for that people, or that that direction you should go, as long as you're consistent with that, whatever it is, you're going to be a productive society. It's fascinating.
It is fascinating.
Yeah. So that you couldn't have a secession movement because you're going against essentially the will of God.
Yeah. And that's kind of what he's talking about here. But in the lead up to the Civil War, he had a real sympathy for the Southerners, is what he's saying. 'Cause he says, the North has constitutional duties that they have to give to the South. Even if they disagree with their laws. He points out, the fugitive slave legislation. You guys can't really just choose not to enforce that. It goes against the Constitution of the country.
Right.
But then when the war finally came, he said Brownson modified his political views, leaving behind a sympathy for state sovereignty, though never renouncing his attachment to states' rights, which he argued was something different.
Yes.
So more so looking at things not that you are an individual sovereign, but you are a state within a bigger sovereign, more or less. And I think that's what a lot of people did, during and after the Civil War. I think I've mentioned this on the podcast, but there's a neat linguistic thing that prior to the Civil War, you more commonly heard people say the United States are.
Yes.
After the Civil War, it was more common to say the United States is, seeing it as one homogenous thing rather than a collection of individuals.
Yes.
Which is an interesting...
Yeah, and that's one of the, I think one of the negative effects of the Civil War is it really emasculated the individual state sovereignty. And when I tell, I taught a class, excuse me, a law class, and it's a foreign concept to people that each of the 50 states is a separate sovereign.
Yeah.
Like in criminal law, you can commit a crime. The same events could be prosecuted in 3 jurisdictions: Illinois, for instance, Missouri, and the federal government. Because each one of them is a separate sovereign, and people don't even have any concept of that. Like they know of the concept in some sense, sovereign immunity, because police officers assert that as a defense when they shoot somebody. But what that means, people don't even know what that means. It means like you can't sue the crown. That goes back to the old common law, English common law. You can't sue the king. The king is the ultimate authority. And so that's just kind of an interesting distinction that he's talking about, like the state sovereignty. And I think that's obviously was discredited by the secessionists. And so that's when you really see, of course, with the necessary evils that the North had to enact in order to preserve the Union, really aggregated power to the central government, which I think over the long term has not been great. Yeah. Although in some respects, simplifying everything and having more uniform commerce is a good thing. But anyway.
Sure. Then he goes on to say that, he began working in the American Republic towards the end of the war, and this is a really difficult time for him. He lost 2 sons. Yeah. He was in controversy with the Catholic Church because he was trying to call on leaders to be more supportive of the Union, and they didn't have adequate support, as he felt. And he says, "I am now nobody," he wrote to several friends in letters at that time. And then the editor here kind of talks a little bit about specific theories within the American Republic. I don't know if we need to talk about those in the context of the introduction, because we'll talk about them in the book itself. Yes. But I thought this introduction, unless there's any other big things you wanted to point out here that we won't really get to in the rest of the book.
I thought it was interesting how, as a Northerner and someone who is not in favor of slavery, who's always opposed to slavery, still was able to have some sympathy for some of the people in the South, and their what do you call it? Their gentlemanly or the genteel attitudes, or more civilized attitudes in some respects. Of course, it's all built upon the slave labor, but and it's fascinating when you read any sort of a history of the Civil War, that they're all praying to a Christian God for divine guidance and providence for victory in battle. Like Stonewall Jackson was didn't know that he did frequently, but he professed that he did not want to initiate aggressive action on the Sabbath, on Sunday. And it's like this guy was responsible for a lot of death, in battle, and personally killed people and all that. So it was a wild time, and it's such a different time in our nation's history because it was universally Christian then. Yeah. I mean, everybody on both sides of the Civil War, all the leadership, everybody was making speeches about God's will and God's providence and the Christian God and this and that. And there's some lip service given to that by politicians now, but quite infrequently, a lot less frequently than when I was a young man. And so it'll be interesting to read how this Catholic thinker viewed Civil War era United States of America. And the Catholics were still at this time persecuted. They were thought
And much
less
fewer
of.
of them in
Yes.
America, for sure, because this is before a lot of the Irish immigration, the Italian immigration a little bit later.
The Irish immigration had started,
but not in full force.
Yeah, not in full force.
And they definitely weren't
yes.
like a significant political factor, for sure.
Well, they were regionally. So there was
yes,
still a large group. Like there were riots in New York City when they were going to be drafted, and a lot of that had to do with the fact that they didn't want to fight to free the slaves, the ethnic Irish. But they understood. A lot of them understood, how it was to be treated as less than human, because the British really viewed them as subhuman. Fascinating. Anyway, it'll be a good read.
Yeah. But I think we should move to the preface.
Introduction
was good, but I think this first sentence here is a long sentence, but I think really describes everything that he's going to talk about here.
Read it.
It says, "In the volume which, with much diffidence, is here offered to the public, I have given, as far as I've considered it worth giving, my whole thought in a connected form on the nature, necessity, extent, authority, origin, ground, and constitution of government, and the unity, nationality, constitution, tendencies, and destiny of the American Republic." Essentially, what is America?
Yeah.
What is its history? What is its future? What is it made of? What is the organization that we call America? What is this thing? And I think that is a good question, and one that I think I mentioned earlier, one that I think a lot of people are talking about now, too, with how crazy everything has been, even just over the past 2 weeks at the time of recording, with an assassination attempt, Biden dropping out of the race, Kamala now
she's not yet the
something.
nominee.
Not yet the nominee, but endorsed by a lot of people at this point.
Yes, she's supposed to have it, but who knows what's going to happen next week.
Biden ousted by his own party, and it seems like we're going back in time to more, early 1900s politics right now. Is really what it feels like, and I've seen a lot of people commenting the same thing. Is like this is kind of crazy, compared to what we've had in the past. And the last couple of elections have already been a little crazy. But this is something new. This is something different.
Well, it's
or something old. Something
different. And it's there are a lot of parallels to the monopolies at the time too, because you're talking about like the late 1800s. You had this super wealthy, and is that much different than the billionaires today that are really the force behind the throne? Because what seemed to motivate everybody in the Democratic Party was the big donors shut off the money. They said, "We're not giving you any money," but he was gone in like 3 days. That's it's a wild world we live in. But we're not yet in a civil war, so it could get worse. It's been worse. The insurrection wasn't the worst thing since the Civil War. I mean, there's been a lot of other really bad things, including a bombing of Congress and people murdered in Congress. Anyway, so it's good to get something a little bit not topical, although related to today's day and age. But I was really encouraged by this. There's a sentence in the second paragraph.
I think I know what you're
I have never been the slave of my own past, and truth has always been dearer to me than my own opinions. And even if he tries to fulfill that in this book, I am encouraged by that.
Because he says, I don't want to consider myself bound to anything I've written before.
Correct.
It's like I want to take this with a new start. I'm going to be informed by the stuff I've written in the past, of course. I'm not a radically different person, but I don't want to just stick with this, worldview that I've created in the past.
Yes.
And then I want to write, really what I think now. Which I think a lot of people should be doing.
Well, I think he's saying something more than that. Not just, it's in my past, but it is only changed because he believes that his current views are more centered with the truth.
Yes, that's critical.
And that is another Tolkien, essential philosophical belief, is that the truth is what's most important. To be true to yourself and to reality and to each other, and not lie. Lies are bad.
Lies are bad.
That's a big Tucker Carlson thing, by the way. His thing is it's no longer liberal versus conservative and this rich versus poor and all that stuff. It's those that tell the truth or try to tell the truth and those that want to lie. And I think he's really, really right about that in pop culture now. And he's, by the way, now the #1 podcast on Spotify.
Really?
Yeah. Just took over
Joe Rogan?
Joe Rogan.
Wow.
That's right.
It's impressive.
Well, Joe Rogan's had a streak of about 562 comedians in a row. And we're all tired of listening to him shoot the breeze with comedians.
Yes. Oh, there you go. But then he goes on to talk about,
Get some more alien people on there. And those guys about the pyramids. And some about the deep sea. I want to know about the deep sea.
There you go. But then on this preface, he says, kind of what I was talking about with his humility earlier. He says, "My work can lay claim to very little artistic merit. It is full of repetitions, the same thought is frequently recurring, the result, to some extent, no doubt, of carelessness and the want of artistic skill." And he goes on, he talks about, it's not that great. And that's really, I think, a refreshing thing to see an author say. And of course, I think he's kind of wrong at this point, that there is a lot of art in his words, just even in these first couple sections that we've read.
Yeah, I wonder if it's false humility, but it doesn't. It rings true to me. I think he really, I think he's put the disclaimer out there because he wishes it was better.
Well, because he also goes on to say, this is another great sentence, he says, "All that is valuable in the thought set forth, it is safe to assume has been appropriated from others." He says, I'm not, the first to think of a lot of these things. I'm 100% borrowing on other people, even if I don't really know it. My thoughts aren't always 100% my own, but I think they are close to the truth.
Again, a favorable contrast to the previous season.
I'm starting a new worldview that is entirely thought up by me.
Also, the biggest criticism of Descartes, I'm starting a new philosophy. I think, therefore, I am. Somebody else might have already thought of something similar, but I don't know. What'd you think about it? He goes on later, I think it's next page. What is this? Roman numeral 29. At the very end, he says, it talks about, universal principles and that kind of stuff. But he says this, which I thought was interesting. An atheist, I have said, may be a politician, but if there were no God, there could be no politics. I think he's probably going to expand on that in this book. I'm fascinated to hear about why there would be no politics if there's no God.
I mean, I'm inclined to think that he's right. And this is in context of him saying that, he's really looking at America as really the summit of everything that's come before. And he sees it like the value, he says the real basis of civilization itself and the value to the world of the Greco-Roman civilization. Talking about how he's ranking everything, how America's sort of the summit of that. Because what he really talks about a lot, it seems like throughout this book, is the idea of providence, that God is present in every government, has a hand in sort of giving to a people the right sort of structure that is right for them, that is the correct thing for that people. And I think what he's really talking about, that with God there is no politics, is that politics, at its root, is just people. Something that is public, something that it has to do with the connections between everybody.
The culture.
And if you are going to have a civilized society, you can't do that without something beyond, something more than just nature. Something that says, this is how you are going to work together. Here are principles that are imbued within you towards your conscience, towards right and wrong, and towards truth, and you can't do that without God.
I guess a herd of bison don't have politics.
They don't.
They might. Is there a hierarchy? But it's not fully developed.
Yes, but it's not a politics. It could be a hierarchical structure, but it's
not a people.
Yeah, because a polis, if you go back to Greek, is a city or a city-state, is where that word comes from.
What's the other one that means people? It's similar to polis.
Populus?
Nah.
That's Latin. That's not Greek, though.
It's not polis? That's city?
Polis is city, yeah.
Polis?
But it became, attributed to like the people.
Oh, so I was right.
Yes.
Very well. He does mention that he is a Catholic, but he's not going to write just exclusively as a Catholic, but can't deny that he is a Catholic.
I like these couple sentences.
That was great. Yeah,
he says, "I am a Catholic by God's grace and great goodness, and must write as I am. I could not write otherwise if I would, and would not if I could. I don't want to be anything other than Catholic, so I'm writing as a Catholic." Okay, that's pretty good.
It kind of reminded me like a Dr. Seuss rhyme.
Yeah, it was. It was very good.
But I do like that he says, that he's not trying to be critical of anybody else. He says, "I honor virtue wherever I see it, and accept truth wherever I find it," which is encouraging. I hope he holds true to that, I assume he is, because we're reading a book from 1865. You'd think it has some sort of lasting power. I wonder if people a century plus from now are going to be reading Mr. Lakoff's books. I suspect
I don't think so. I don't think so at all. And he talks about,
unless there's a nuclear war and it's the last thing to read when you're going to the bathroom. All the other books have been destroyed. Yeah. Give me another page of Lakoff.
That'd be miserable.
No, I want to read it.
That's stupid. And then he talks about, Catholics are a growing population. We're here, we're kind of here to stay. But he says, I have no fears that my book will be neglected because validly by a Catholic author and from a Catholic publishing house. Because people just aren't going to read it. But hopefully in the future, people will.
Yes.
But that's about all he has to say in the preface, unless you have any other.
Yeah, I like to read his last statement here. All I can say is that it is an honest book, a sincere book, and contains my best thoughts on the subjects treated. If well received, I shall be grateful. If neglected, I shall endeavor to practice resignation, as I have so often done. Yeah. I just thought it was I'm just encouraged by the preface, and I'm like rooting for this guy. I'm rooting for the book to be good. Mm-hmm. There's an introduction. I also read that too.
we haven't.
Yes. Sorry, I thought that was my parting words.
Yes.
I wasted them.
Yes, the introduction.
I have to come up with other parting words.
The introduction is also the first chapter. It's only 9 pages here. It seems like fairly short chapters.
The beginning is the best part.
Yes, I agree. If you want to.
No, go ahead.
Okay.
Go ahead. No.
He says, the ancients summed up the whole of human wisdom in the maxim, know thyself. And certainly there is for an individual no more important as there is no more difficult knowledge than knowledge of himself, whence he comes, whither he goes, what he is for, and what he can do, what he ought to do, and what are his means of doing it. And then he goes on to say, nations are only individuals on a larger scale, which is a very ancient idea, because that's exactly what Plato talks about in the Republic, is that's why they even talk about a republic at all, because he says the republic is really just an analogy or just the human soul on a bigger level when he's setting up his perfect societies, and that's how you should order your soul, how you should order, yourself. So that's an idea that's been present for thousands of years, and he seems to be picking up on that and adding to that in a very American way. It seems.
I don't know that I agree with it, but we'll go forward.
Sure.
Yes.
And then he talks about among nations, no one has more need of full knowledge of itself than the United States, and no one has hitherto had less. And I think that's fairly true. I mean, especially for the time that he's writing. I mean, you have, the Federalist Papers, and you have Tocqueville a little bit before this, writing about, what is America and what are the American people. But it was seen as such a new thing, and for a long time as a fairly inconsequential thing, I think, by a lot of the rest of the world who are looking at, these peasant people who are living out on this, landmass that hasn't really been discovered and isn't really well defined, in the inner lands. And of course, you have people out there to some extent, but it was seen as, a place for commerce mostly, as a way of trading materials.
Well, and the European powers, they were in awe of the both the North and the South armies, especially the North at the end. The industrialized, almost mechanized. I mean, they didn't have tanks, but the scale of the armies and the amount of lethal firepower and lethality of the troops was really a big surprise to the European powers.
Yeah.
I think they're the ones that sent emissaries over and observed it. They were shocked by how quickly both sides of the war were able to arm up and fight huge battles. Yeah. I mean, at the end, the South was getting strangled, by the continuous embargo and all that, but they still had 70,000 under arms at the very end, and the North had about 250 to 300,000 effective troops. Yeah, that's a huge number for the country that size. It was crazy.
Yeah,
and so at this point, after that war is over, that and the fact that the North economy could still function and they can mount all these people, they can equip all these people and feed them, and it just must have been very. It just changed their entire society and the way they looked at themselves, not just as a bunch of rural pasture, people living in the hinterlands.
Well, I mean, can you also even imagine, like, looking at this, these people fighting each other on a scale, never before seen, and then somehow the country still survives.
Yes.
That somehow that a union still exists after this horrible thing, and, of course, there's a lot of hardship to go through in the decades after the Civil War, but that they continued to actually exist and brought themselves back from that, I think would also be remarkable to see as well.
You'd almost have to, in a weird way, believe in some sort of providential influence on the outcome.
Exactly. He then also makes a good point, which I think is still true today. I'm on page 4 here, that first full paragraph on the page. He says, its vision is still obscured by the floating mists of its earlier morning, saying that we don't really know, or a lot of people don't recognize, the founding of America, because it was very much mythologized, I think, especially at this point now.
Yeah.
And, what was really going on, what are really the values and the ideas and the actual truth behind the founding of America.
Yeah, I don't know if we even know now, though.
Because he was kind of opposed, this is talked about in the introduction, I'll talk about it later, to like the compact theory.
Yes,
right. The idea that it was just like the principles of John Locke, that if we all just agree and get along, therefore, we have a state. And he wasn't really in favor of those ideas. And Russell Kirk echoes the same thing. That wasn't so much, these abstract theories that are what created America. It's the people and the customs they brought with them, the English common law and things like that, more hard concepts rather than vague theories by concurrent or contemporary thinkers.
Yes, agreed.
Mm-hmm. And then that's what he talks about after that. Every living nation has an idea given it by providence to realize, and whose realization is its special work, mission, or destiny. He says the Jews were the chosen people of God for their traditions to be passed along through the Messiah. The Greeks were the chosen people of God for the development and realization of art, and of the true in science and philosophy, and the Romans for the development of the state law and jurisprudence. And he says the Asians and the Africans, they didn't really have too much going on. They don't have too much to offer, which I think is a little bit dismissive, of course. But
he probably didn't have a whole lot of knowledge of the ancient Chinese civilizations and Japanese civilizations.
And of course, in the context of the founding of America, the Asian forms of government or the African did not have really any influence there, of course.
Right. So, but he's making a slightly different point. Is that like despotic and tribal governments that didn't value education and advancement of the society.
Yeah, he says,
I think that's what he's really talking about.
History has not recorded their mission, and as far as they are known, they have contributed only to the abnormal development or corruption of religion and civilization. Despotism is barbaric and abnormal, and that's what he has to say about the African and Asian governments.
I think he's right to the point, depending on what he's talking about.
Yes.
If he's talking about the limited, known, violent tribal, regional governments such as they were in some parts of Asia and some parts of Africa, I think that would be that'd be true. But that's what I'm guessing.
Yeah.
That he's not making a comment as broadly as what it sounds.
Yeah.
But I'm glad it's still published here, so we can read it in his own words.
And he has so many great quotes. I feel like I'm just going to end up reading this whole book, so I'll try not to. But he says,
read 4 more.
Okay, for the end of
this episode.
For the end of the episode. Okay, I'll keep that in mind.
Oh, I thought you were gonna.
Oh, just gonna do them now.
Well, what else are we gonna do? I don't know.
I was just gonna summarize. I was gonna briefly go through things.
Okay, go ahead.
Because he says, the United States, its mission is to fulfill everything that has come before. It needs to surpass Greece in its art and in its science. It needs to surpass Rome in its system of government. And then he goes on. He says, Aristotle knew only 4 forms of government: monarchy, aristocracy, democracy, and mixed governments. America's not any of these. We have to figure out what this thing is that we have created and that we're living under, or that was given to us by providence, really, and figure out how we can use this system to further all of these things and make sure that America is this summit of civilization as he saw it.
Yes.
And I think that's still a good goal to have.
It's a great goal.
Yeah.
whether we can even aspire to it today, I don't know. It's so funny that we spend so much money on education of our youth and of us, and we have so many resources, but I feel dumber than what I was.
Yeah.
I can only talk about society. It's like you have a guy like this who's self-taught, brilliant guy, and maybe we should just go back to being self-taught.
Yeah.
Read books.
I mean, that's a good point, too. It's like, I hope he talks about it in here, at least. What is the purpose of education in a society? Maybe he won't talk about it, because a lot of the times it wasn't the duty of the government at all, at this point that he's talking about. But the education of the citizens of a country is one of the most important things, and we're letting probably the worst people do it in this country, for the most part, in our school systems, and that's just terrible and does not spell good things for the future of the country. What else do you have to add?
Do I? I was going to say one other thing towards the end. He was talking about the secession movement, and I'm skipping to 7. He mentions this quote: "This tendency to a centralized democracy had more to do with provoking secession and rebellion than the anti-slavery sentiments of the northern, central, and western states." And I guess we talk about anti-slavery sentiments in those other states, but I think it may overstate it a little bit, in my opinion. But there's something to that as far as the South's complaints that the North was aggrandizing power to themselves and picking and choosing what statutes and what laws that they were going to enforce within their borders, and not reciprocal in the South.
Yeah.
And I don't know about the relative influence of that, but it's not a nothing in that discussion. The heart of it all, of course, was slavery, which brought it to a head. Yeah. But there's something he talks about. He seems to be of the philosophy that a decentralized government is what he is going to be advocating for. I assume.
Well,
as
what
part
he
of this
says,
republic.
He seems very hostile to democracy itself
Yes,
as
right.
just a form of
bit,
government.
yeah.
He says the tendency of American politics for the last 30 or 40 years has been, within the several states themselves, in the direction of centralized democracy, as if the American people had for their mission only the reproduction of ancient Athens. And I think that's a great point.
Yes.
Because I think that's what a lot of people think America is or should be, and that's just if 51% of people want something, it should be given to them. And that's not really what is in the good of a nation. That's not really what our country is set up to do. That's something that I think a lot of people have forgotten or just ignore, that we're not just a simple democracy.
People don't understand the danger of democracy.
Yeah.
They have generally. I mean, there are a lot of people that do. Of course, I'm not. This is not a unique thought to me, but our public at large, it's a shocking statement. Like if I say to my staff, which although maybe now that wouldn't be that big a deal, but they're very smart people. But they're not interested in politics at all. Yeah. If I said to them, we don't live in a democracy, they'll think it's like a criticism of the current state of the world, like a conspiracy theory or whatever. But they won't understand, if I say, no, it's a republic. Yeah. We don't actually decide things as a democracy here. And it would probably make their heads turn, they're not stupid, and I think they all understand the concepts and all that stuff. But it's not something that people generally know or even talk about. Yeah. And they'll say, well, it's a threat to like the Democrats are all over this, the threat to our democracy. And so because there's a threat to our democracy, we're going to completely upend the entire democratic process of selecting our nominee and assassinate our rival because we were trying to incarcerate him, but the bastard wouldn't go to jail. This is a bitch.
We democratically voted to send him to jail. I don't know why he's not going.
He's a threat to our democracy. That's a huge problem, and I don't know what the solution to that is, but it's a fundamental problem that we're having, that people back then, when you didn't have any sort of public school system, they didn't have any electricity, for Christ's sake, no running water, or very little. I mean, some of the metropolitan areas would, in sewer systems, but the vast majority of people were living on a farm or a property. They were agrarian. And they had an outhouse, and they had a well that you'd fill a bucket and bring the bucket of water into the house. I mean, it's for them to know that we had a republic better than we know now. It just blows my mind. Yeah. And it still blows my mind that I have this smartphone. Of course, for you, it's not that big a deal because you grew up with them. But this phone has more information times a million than I had in our New World Encyclopedia volumes, which took up 2 shelves in our bookcase at home. It's just, and people don't even read and don't know anything, and I think that's a problem. Anyway, so I'm encouraged by this guy, and I really liked. I'm sorry to go on a little rant. That's right. That was probably my first rant. I had another mini rant earlier, but I love this towards the end where he says. Let's see.
Was it a work written with temper? Because I was going to read that quote. I think that's a great quote.
I like this. It is in his judgment. I'm trying to think about the author. He's saying presented to the understanding and love of his countrymen. Like he's just talking about how he loves America, and he's writing this basically as almost like a love letter to the country. I just thought that was That was really neat.
I was going
inspiring.
to read this quote. It's a bit of a longer one. He says, a work written with temper, without passion or sectional prejudice, in a philosophical spirit, explaining to the American people their own national constitution and the mutual relations of the general government and the state governments cannot, at this important crisis in our affairs, be inopportune, and if properly executed, can hardly fail to be of real service.
Yes.
I think that is absolutely true. And
It's
I think
true of our podcast, too.
Yeah, exactly. And I think one more, jab at our last book is that was theoretically, George Lakoff's goal was his, completely unbiased examination of everything. But to see how refreshing this is, and to see how his goals are the truth, and how he's actually going forward and trying to describe things properly rather than just giving a horrible, biased, allegedly unbiased account is refreshing to read.
Well, I will say this. At the beginning of the last book, I was encouraged by Lakoff's statement and disclaimers, if we will recall.
But I think
I was wrong.
You said that like in relation to everything else about this is bad, but at least he said this thing. And in this book, you're saying everything about this is good. So I think we're in a better spot this time.
No, I'm encouraged. I'm really interested to see what this guy had to say. Yeah. And of course, some of it's going to be untimely because it was written so many years ago. But if it was true then, it'll carry truth for us today too. Yes. I think that there's something about that if you write something that's accurate and true at the time, 150 years later, it's still going to be true.
Yeah, exactly.
It'll have value to us today.
Exactly.
Deep thoughts.
Well, we should be plowing ahead with this fairly soon. If we want to get back on our schedule, we'll have another episode to record this weekend because we delayed a few days because you were sick, of course.
Yes. My first cold since I got my nose surgery. It's very discouraging.
Yes. Well, do you have any other final thoughts on this first section of Orestes Brownson's The American Republic?
No.
All right. Well, this has been Season 9, Episode 1 of Unlimited Opinions. I am Adam Bishop.
I'm Mark Bishop.
And you can, of course, follow us on Twitter at ULMTD Opinions.
Still Mark Bishop.
Still Mark Bishop. There you go. I was curious if you would get that in there.